Okay, wow. As the numbers are slowing down a little bit in terms of their rise, why don't we launch right in? Um, uh, my name is Chris Weeb, and I'm the Manager of Heritage Policy and Government Relations at the National Trust for Canada. This is one of our regular gatherings of the heritage sector, and this one is on a very important topic, communicating heritage conservation as climate action, challenges, and opportunities. And I'm very excited to be bringing this to you today. I want to begin by recognizing that I'm coming to you from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And why are we having these gatherings? Just to set things up, well, these are an opportunity really for the heritage conservation sector to come together and talk about current issues. And I really think of these ones as learning spaces where we can talk through complex issues and hopefully walk away with some strong, actionable insights. And I'm excited to have 5 panelists with us today to help us with that stimulating discussion. So just a few things about logistics and format. We're going to begin our agenda today with a short 5-minute opening observations from each of the panelists, and then we'll move into general discussion. The general discussion will involve the panelists asking some questions to each other, I'm anticipating, but we also want to hear from you. So there's the chat function, which we're trying to reserve more for general observations and logistical issues. And if you want to really get a pointed question to the panel, please put it in the Q&A box. It's sometimes hard to see some of the really interesting observations and respond to the questions if they're buried after a while in a deepening chat list. So please make use of the chat, the Q&A function. And if there are chats coming through, please make sure that you're with the drop-down menu, sending them to all panelists and attendees, if that's what you want to do, because then we can all see it. If it's going to separate individuals, it becomes invisible to the others. So why don't, Emily, if you would just mind going to the next slide, please. So just a few words about the National Trust. We were created in 1973, and we're a membership-based charity that works to empower communities in saving and renewing Canada's heritage places. One of the things we've been working on these days as a part of this larger Making Reuse the New Normal project is a National Trust survey identifying barriers to older heritage building reuse. And this drills down into very specific issues. And we've had over 150 people respond from across the country. And we are very excited about having the opportunity to have a bigger sample. And I think my colleague, Rob Peugeot, will hopefully put in the chat the link to that survey. And I'm hoping that some of you can be a part of that as well. This actually, it's interesting. This is part of Mohkinstis. This image up on the screen was a part of the Calgary Indigenous Heritage Roundtable that we had in 2015, and it was from Treaty 7 territory. And we've woven that kind of exploration of Indigenous cultural heritage seamlessly into the conference, the National Trust Conference, ever since. Natalie, Emily, can you move to the next slide? And with that, one public service announcement. We're having our conference coming up with CAP and with help from the Indigenous Heritage Circle as well. The National Trust Conference will be virtual this year, and there's a call for presentations, and it has a very dynamic title and theme this year around really meeting this kind of historic moment that we're in, heritage and the global reset. So I want to throw it out to you to think about throwing your ideas in the ring and being a part of this national conversation. So next slide, please, Emily. Wanted to begin, before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to set up this discussion just a little bit. So, you know, this moment that we're at here, this gathering about communicating heritage conservation as a climate action, I think it comes out of this sudden feeling at this moment that the building, a green building in the reuse space is suddenly filled up with all sorts of words and ideas. And we're trying to explore how to get in front of, how to position ourselves within this kind of cacophony of ideas and voices. Do we Do we remonstrate and argue with certain characterizations about older places and older buildings and landscapes? Do we hitch our wagons to some of these new ideas? I put this Wordle up here with some different ideas as well, just to try to capture some of the multiplicity of things that are coming at us. And it feels really busy and hard to get in front of these things. So one of the things we will want to do is think about how do we as a heritage movement meet this moment in terms of our response to it. And because it feels like a radical social and economic realignment, and we want to be involved in helping to shape that. There's also many groups making making pronouncements about various things and making pledges. So how do we align ourselves with them as well? So to guide us through this tangled forest of words and ideas, we have 5 panelists from across the country today. And Emily, if you can just move that up there. The 5, I'll put them in the speaking order that they're going to initially present in. First off will be Susan Ross, and she's an associate professor in the Indigenous and Canadian Studies Department at Carleton University. Then we'll hear from Melody Lapine, who's one of the board of directors for the Indigenous Heritage Circle, the national organization, which looks at Indigenous cultural heritage places in Canada. She's also the director of the Mikisew Cree First Nation Government and Industry Relations, and she's coming to us from Fort McMurray. Then we'll hear from Tom Morrison, who's an engineer, the principal engineer with Heritage Standing in Fredericton, and he was also an organizer of an important recent meeting looking at climate heritage, which was the Tedx Event, which happened in October, and it's still online, I believe. And then we'll hear from Judith Mosley, who's the executive director of the Vancouver Heritage Foundation, and her organization's been doing a lot of work around communicating the green building and heritage places message in Vancouver for over 10 years. It must be almost 15 years. So BC's been at the forefront. We'll want to hear from her. And then finally, we'll hear from Shannon Bateman, who's the current National Trust YCW intern. She's a textile artist and heritage researcher, and she's up in Thunder Bay and Ontario. And I want to acknowledge a generous donation from a National Trust donor, Chris Tweel, who has made it possible for Shannon to be here today. Chris's generous support helped Shannon's YCW internship with the Trust, and we're going to hear more from Shannon about what she's been up to over the last number of months. So that'll be exciting, and thank you, Chris Tweel. So on to the first panelist, and that is Susan Ross. And Susan is as I say, has been at the forefront of, I think, the discussion between the dialogue between sustainability and heritage for the last, I would say, 15 years. So she's a great person to start with and can contextualize some of the things that are happening right now. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Bonjour, Kwe. Thank you, Chris, for this introduction and for the invitation to participate in this important conversation, which I'm attending from Ottawa, so miigwech to the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Chris mentioned that I'm going to talk more about the international context. So one of these is the Climate Heritage Network, an international effort to ensure culture and heritage are on the radar in international climate action, and which Carleton University recently joined. This network operates in part through working groups focused on clarifying the messages needed at international assemblies like the upcoming COP26 in November. Working Group 3, for example, is focused on making the case for building reuse through better metrics. The need for updated and relevant data is an ongoing issue. To make a climate-related argument, you need a certain amount of quantification to advance understanding. So I was also asked to provide a more historical perspective given my longer term involvement. And there is indeed much to learn from organizations at all levels who've been active in this work for some time. I'll just focus on two initially, but there are many others. So earlier this month, the Institute for Sustainable Heritage at the University College London celebrated its 20th anniversary with a 4-day symposium. Some of the Institute's earliest critical work were its reports on how to assess climate risks for heritage sites. This pioneering group has provided precise methodologies to the needed work in monitoring, mitigation, adaptation, and managing loss. Another longer-term player is the Association for Preservation Technology. Since 2003, the APT Technical Committee on Sustainable Preservation has led multiple initiatives progressively related to climate change, but also resilience, disaster preparation, and carbon reduction. Importantly, this work has been collaborative, working closely with partners like the national trusts in Canada and the US, with environmental associations and many others, and so helping forge needed synergies. Other organizations, including governments and non-governmental partners, have all been working to expand our knowledge of climate change impacts in global contexts, while carrying out the research needed at the local level to develop policy, best practices, and guidelines. Here are just a few of the many resources that now exist. So this includes many reports that now address the climate heritage issues of specific regions as developed by local to national governments. And you see a bunch of those kind of in the middle two columns on the right. But in the left and in gray are equally important resources where heritage conservation may not be named in the title or even mentioned by name, but they engage with important cultural concerns from environmental justice to Indigenous rights. And then on the right are two resources I draw attention to. One is my own contribution to APT was to help assemble an annotated bibliography on recent publications about cultural heritage and climate change. And when we produced this in 2016, there were already over 60 research reports, scientific articles, and policies for us to include. On the bottom right is the one report I would recommend everyone look at right away if you've not seen it, which is ICOMOS's incredibly helpful The Future of Our Past from 2019. This is an essential guide to how we can all act to address climate in our heritage work on multiple fronts. Now, despite all these resources, we're still, of course, often engaged in quite introductory discussions. So for my last few slides and comments, I want to focus on the communication side of climate action. As much as we need reliable data and critical analysis as evidence for our arguments, it's increasingly clear that more direct forms of communication are essential. So graphics and posters with creative and compelling words and images are key. And on the left is a summary illustration from the ICOMOS report I just mentioned, which shows how communication is indeed ranked at the very top of priorities. And on the right is the very compelling graphic summarizing the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals for 2015 to 2030 with keywords and images that I have found very useful for teaching. In our new or renewed age of marches, but also social media, keywords and images are now everywhere as part of posters and protests. These gatherings show how heritage as part of climate action is joining forces with multiple groups, from Indigenous peoples, youth and students to climate scientists. One important group to know about in the online protest march for heritage as climate action is the Union of Concerned Scientists, who completely get the idea that culture being at risk is important to science. But I personally take huge inspiration from the water walkers who draw attention to the fate of the Great Lakes with their annual walks, as well as Christy Bilcour's amazing posters on protecting sacred waters. As an academic, I want to express an ongoing belief in the books that can change how we see things. This volume on the left on the future of heritage as climate change has helped me to see that what we need now are in fact different conceptions of heritage itself to become ready to embrace more change and see that loss can also be productive, even creative. And on the other hand, the comics that have become a major vehicle for more general teaching about climate change. And I love this history of the International Panel on Climate Change that's told from a distant time in the future when apparently we have survived. To end, I'll just share my favorite slogan from the National Trust, which dates back to 2008. And if we have time, I might try to elaborate on how this specific message has been evolving. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's a great introduction, a great overview of some of the things that are happening right now, and a great kind of provocation for the rest of us to get things moving. I want to now shift to, I'm going to hold my questions for you, like as others will as well. And I want to go shift to Melody Lapine, who's with the Indigenous Heritage Circle, and she's in Fort McMurray with the Mikisew Cree First Nation Government and Industrial Relations. And she's coming to us from Treaty 8. And I wanted to, I think that's a great link because Susan was talking about the need for direct forms of communication. And I think some of Melody's experiences can help us with that. So I'm going to hand it over to Melody.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you for inviting me to speak about some of the work that I'm doing. I'm from my home here in Fort McMurray, northeastern Alberta, within Treaty 8 territory. I'm a citizen of the Mikisew Cree First Nation, both Cree and Dene, and within the traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, and Métis Nations up here in northeastern Alberta. So I think everybody could see my slides. I just quickly put together a couple of just introduction slides, but I'll end it with sharing some examples of some of the work that I'm doing on some of the challenges here in the region and some of the, of course, in the added impacts from climate change on important cultural heritage sites for the Mikisew Cree. So first, I'll just introduce the Mikisew Cree. So we're one of 5 First Nations in the Athabasca region. We're considered one of the largest First Nations up here. There's about 3,000 members of us. Many of us are located here in Fort McMurray, but our hometown community is one of the oldest settlements in Alberta, Fort Chipewyan, which is on the north shore of Lake Athabasca, an old fur trading post and sort of considered one of the gateways to the north back in the day as everybody came up the Athabasca River. So our region, I think, is I have a slide just showing some of the regional context of what we're challenged with. But specifically for us, for the Mikisew Cree, our sort of our cultural heritage, our cultural landscape is really about the land, and protecting the land is really about protecting our cultural heritage, our Mikisew identity, as our relationship with the land is being, challenged by a number of different impacts and influences, including climate change. We call ourselves people of the Delta. The Peace Athabasca Delta is considered one of the world's largest freshwater deltas. And one of the reasons that it became a World Heritage Site is because a lot of these sort of natural phenomena like the Delta predator-prey relationship and a lot of these ecological functions within Wood Buffalo National Park. And so for us, protecting the park, a World Heritage Site, and as well as the areas outside of the site are all equally important, whether or not it's the World Heritage Site, of course, does have a strong international significance and an importance for Canada and Canadians as one of their heritage sites. But for us, the areas outside of the site are equally important because they are really our territory. And so when we define cultural heritage and landscape, it kind of goes beyond some of these borders, including the boundaries of Alberta and Saskatchewan as an example. So I'll just go to the next slide here. So this is just a map just to kind of show you where we are. I mentioned Wood Buffalo National Park being the World Heritage Site. This specific slide shows a really recent proposed project, would have been considered the world's largest open pit mine, the Teck Frontier project. Teck has withdrawn that project in its application just days before the federal government was to make a decision on this project. But you could see from the map just how close that huge project footprint is to, our Delta, our Wood Buffalo National Park. And so that was really concerning for us. So we put a lot of time and effort in working with the federal government and working with the proponent Teck on trying to mitigate and deal with a lot of these concerns. And a lot of the concerns that we have been escalated up to UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee, just really basically saying a lot of these outside influences, including oil sands projects and development, including hydroelectric projects on the piece, a lot of these outside external, outside of the site, are having a significant impact downstream or within the site. And then, of course, all of this being exacerbated with climate change, having the world's largest freshwater delta really literally drying, and being lost and degraded over the years has been really worrisome and troublesome for my nation. So bringing this attention to the World Heritage was one of the things that we've been working on, but other things, of course, is working with proponents like hydroelectric developers and companies like Tech in raising the awareness on the importance of cultural heritage and the cultural landscape for Mikisew. The next slide is kind of another map. This just shows you the intensity of land disturbance outside of Wood Buffalo National Park. But again, the delta being the significance for us is at significant risk. And of course, the pace and scale of development over the last 30, 40 years has been really unprecedented, you know, as a number of these projects, many of them starting multiple times. You know, 1 year, I think I've participated in like 2 back-to-back regulatory hearings for 2 massive projects. And some of our frustrations with a number of these activities is the way that environmental impact assessments are done. Cultural and heritage and understanding, you know, Indigenous connections to the land and specifically the Mikisew Cree relationship to our cultural landscape and the importance of protecting some of these important places and understanding how thresholds in managing environmental impacts has a direct impact on our way of life and our cultural existence basically within our territory. So a number of these activities and all of that, those red dots really have been advancing without a lot of consideration and understanding of cultural impacts and cultural relationships to the land, including the Wood Buffalo National Park and the Peace Athabasca Delta. So many times we see projects happening far away, like a massive hydroelectric project that are like 400 kilometers away, and the importance of a cultural heritage site like Wood Buffalo and the Delta are not considered to be impacted because we're downstream, we're far away. And so therefore, when impact assessments do not include culture, heritage, and way of life and Indigenous rights, then they cannot really identify what the impact is. Therefore, they can't identify how to mitigate and address those impacts because they're not assessed. So how do we adaptively manage these impacts? And then how do you add in things like climate change, which are making things, again, much worse? So these impact assessments, in our view, were poorly done and, you know, didn't include things like climate change and the importance of culture and heritage. So good news is that we have a new federal Impact Assessment Act. Mikisew was a strong supporter of Bill C-69, and you know now we see, and we're actually going through the new act with a new project in the region here, and there is a strong you know space and ability to include cultural impact assessments in the new act, including understanding Mikisew way of life and our relationship with our land. So that could help, you know, now us doing these cultural impact assessments as part of resource development projects, like a new mine coming up, we can understand what the impacts would be and then do a better job in trying to understand how to mitigate and apply things like adaptive management and shared governance on how to address those impacts. That is sort of the summary of my slides. I'll give 2 more examples of some of the things that I'm doing in terms of trying to address the issue of climate change and protection of culture and heritage. Indigenous protected areas. So one of the targets that Canada has is biodiversity and conservation of biodiversity under Target 1. And so we were successful in creating an Indigenous protected area. You could see on this map, just south of that green area, there's not much development. It almost looks like a bit of a natural buffer there to our delta, which, you know, our waters are coming from Birch Mountain, going all the way north into the delta here. And so we managed to protect this area. I'm sorry I didn't put it on this map. And it is called Kitaskinanue Nene. And it is now considered to be one of the world's largest intact boreal forests, very important cultural landscape for Mikisew. You connect that with the Wood Buffalo National Park, and now we have this this sort of band of protected areas because it connects with some other protected areas that serve as important caribou and bison habitat, as well as important Mikisew use area. So conservation in protected areas is some of the work that I'm also advancing in the region. And the creation of this new wildland park was a very important success story. And I think a really good recognition of collaboration, working with both federal, provincial, governments, as well as resource developers, because it was really, these were oil sands leases and these companies donated their leases for a protected area. And I'll just close it off with the importance of collecting information and data to help make informed decisions about resource development projects. And some of the other work that I'm doing is community-based monitoring and collecting data on the land, oral traditional knowledge from our elders and land users, and using that to allow our community to help understand the changes caused by climate, caused by resource development. And so this is empowering the community. And as a result of a lot of our community-based monitoring efforts, we are now building a network through Tracking Change, which is about mobilizing watershed protection and watershed governance. As well as we're working really hard to develop a new research center called the Delta Institute, which would help drive further research and protection of the Peace Athabasca Delta. So collection of information, research, and collaboration is some of the work also to share in addition to the impact assessments. So with that, I'll end there and be happy to answer questions when Chris opens that up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melody. And great thoughts there in terms of connecting dots between local environmental disturbance and big impacts, distant impacts. And I think that's an important connection between northern resource extraction, GHG emissions in the south, and also the subsequent impacts on traditional territories for Indigenous peoples in the north, near north and far north. So we'll get to that a little bit further, hopefully with some more questions. But next, we're going to go to Judith Mosley, who's at the Vancouver Heritage Foundation. She's the executive director. And we're going to hear a little bit about some of the things that they've been working on over the last number of years. Judith?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I'm at Vancouver Heritage Foundation. We're a registered charity. And we're really focused on promoting the appreciation and conservation of heritage places. We do that through educational programs, online resources and grants, and really helping people learn about local history and cultural heritage, and particularly supporting them, providing support in how to look after heritage places. And our work here in Vancouver takes place on the traditional, ancestral and ceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. VHF has been talking about sustainability for over a decade, for sure, and making that connection with heritage retention and conservation, really drawing on the resources and information from heritage organizations in the US and Canada, and responding to City of Vancouver initiatives too. We've done lots of educational programs in that time, including, I think we started out really with a symposium. We've had workshops, publications, case studies, and really weaving it through our major house tour events as well that we've done annually. And since 2015, we've had a grant program focused on homeowners that I'll talk a little bit about. And along the way as well, we've provided comment to City of Vancouver policy developments and really tried to provide good input to that and keep this conversation going and connection between heritage and climate. So it's quite interesting to look back in preparing for this. I sort of took a look back at you know, what we have put out there, what we've been doing for all those years, and our key messages have been pretty consistent in what we've been doing. We've talked broadly about older buildings, so not just those with particular heritage significance. We've talked about sustainability quite broadly as well, so social, cultural, and economic sustainability as well as environmental. And of course, the key concepts of embodied energy, materials, retention and reuse, avoiding waste, minimal intervention, improving performance, really, picking up on all that messaging that's coming from elsewhere, all the great information and data that we've been able to draw on as well, and try and turn it to sort of our practical local environment. In that time, of course, City of Vancouver policy, their policy landscape has changed and evolved a lot. So I think really starting with eco-density probably in 2007, 2008, that was a big city initiative that really started taking steps towards this. The Greenest City Action Plan in 2011, then building code changes that really started to relate to sustainability and bring that into the mix. And increasingly, there's a big focus on climate action, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions from existing buildings. I think that's been there sort of all along, but it seems to really have taken a bigger focus more recently. And just last year in 2020, the Climate Emergency Action Plan was adopted, and that's a big document, lots of actions involved in that, but it has a number of big moves, including number 4, which relates to existing buildings, really aiming to cut emissions, carbon emissions from existing buildings significantly by 2030 and progressively from there on. And the big change there as well is to set limits on emissions that owners will have to comply with from their buildings. So it's going to really change what people have to do as time goes on. I mean, there are thousands of older homes and buildings across Vancouver, and they have been identified as the worst offenders with the highest emissions. There's about 22,000 pre-1950 homes, that's City of Vancouver numbers, and over 50% of carbon emissions in the city comes from buildings, so primarily from natural gas for heating, space and water heating. So, that's the challenge. And I think our position as VHF has been to really seek recognition of heritage and other older buildings as having a positive role in climate action solutions. So we've really aimed to communicate that feasibility and the benefits of retention and upgrading instead of rebuilding and doing destructive retrofits, taking a different approach to that. We've had, I think, some success in helping create options for both heritage registered buildings, but also for character homes and buildings, to have some options to customize solutions. So to have some different ways to meet the goals and to reduce emissions and so on. But I think getting awareness of those options so that they're really explored and used by professionals and owners is an ongoing effort for sure. The messaging is very strong, of course, in the broader industry and from utilities and so on. And our messaging is a bit different than that, and that takes some work to get that out there. The Heritage Energy Retrofit Grant is a program that we've pursued with funding provided by the City of Vancouver. So we've worked with them to develop it, and we manage it and promote it. And it's really focused on helping homeowners reduce their homes' greenhouse gas emissions, so adding to provincial incentives, but with specific guidance and emphasis on retaining heritage character and elements, including windows. So really looking at encouraging non-destructive retrofits, not removing all the interior finishes or the exterior cladding to insulate and so on, taking a more aligned approach that's kinder to the heritage character and elements of the building. So the focus is on insulation, air sealing, space and water heating, increasingly electric heat pumps. In BC, a lot of our electricity is hydroelectric, so it's considered clean energy source and a great way to reduce your carbon emissions if you can switch fuel. And so this approach, obviously we've been working with the City of Vancouver, and I think it has a lot in common with the Climate Emergency Action Plan, but we take it that step further in really considering heritage elements more specifically and trying to have an approach that accommodates that. I think in our experience, homeowners they're really interested in reducing emissions and improving energy efficiency. They're also often motivated by comfort, reducing drafts, having better heating. People are looking for that in their older homes, and so it's a way that those things can come together, and they can really reduce their emissions quite significantly with taking some some steps that don't have to be destructive. I think windows is an area where our messaging differs a lot from the general promotion by the utilities and industry. Many homeowners come to the program because they're looking for support for retrofits and get directed to us because they have an older home. And so we have a lot of conversations about windows because many people think that's the first place to go, is to replace all your windows with something plastic. For homeowners, it's really a complex process. It's a big investment to do retrofits. So we found that the guidance and support is really important, as well as the grants. And I think really that's been a theme through what VHF has done all along, is really provide practical information, support and guidance, try to make it easier, both in terms of the policy framework, but also just practical supports, and really help people take action and be able to make a difference. So that's what we've been doing.
Thanks so much, Judith. And I think Vancouver, there's been so many things happening there, with a lot of, with property values rising and pressure on older buildings. There's been a lot of innovation that's happened in the Lower Mainland that needs to come to the rest of Canada. So I think a lot of us can learn from your work in terms of translating that and meeting people in their own properties. Moving on to Tom Morrison, who's in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and he's an engineer there with Heritage Standing, but he's also going to talk to us today about his organization, his help organizing CAP, Tedx CAP, which is a meeting this past fall. He can tell us more about that, trying to translate some of these climate heritage actions into a more mainstream, to a more audience, and also his work with the Heritage Hackathon. So with high school students. I'm going to pass it on to Tom.
Thank you. To reveal a little transparency here, Chris helped prompt us with some different questions. So there are two main questions I'm going to try and touch on here, as he says, the TEDx and the hackathon. First, I want to make a quick note. I'm a little bit different than everyone on the panel because I'm not necessarily traditionally a sustainability guy. I don't even work with mechanical systems. I'm a structural engineer. That also links into what I think I can bring value and something for people to take away from this greater session, is the fact that it doesn't matter that much where you're coming from. There's ways you can get involved and contribute and try to make a difference. I mean, for myself, somehow between, making sure people in my office are employed and busy and happy and keeping my kids growing and all that stuff, I somehow decided to take on running a TED event because, hey, why not? And if anyone wants to pay me for one of those things in the future, that would be awesome. But I'll digress. Point is, I think we're all on the same point. We want to be able to look at, be it our children, our future generation, whatever it is, and be able to say, you know what, we did what we could. I had this conversation with one of my kids, and my kids number at the point you might call them a brood if you were from outside or not being as polite. And one of them was talking about how big a stress it is for them. I mean, he's 9. Sorry, that's the 11-year-old. He's 11. And he was talking about how big a stress climate change and that idea weighs on him. And at the same time, I talk back to him and say, okay, let's take this and look at some of the history. Look at these examples where suddenly humanity hits that tipping point that we say, hey, it's time we get our act together. Let's change things. And we can. And so that's kind of the path I work on there. So I come from a bit of a different background, but as my wife has once said, one of my strengths is taking really technical, complex puzzles and trying to find simpler solutions or directions or ways to step out of it. And all these things I've done, there have been a number of people helping, and a number of them are on this link as well. So in October 2020, we did a TEDx event. Most people are familiar with the TED brand. Ours was Tedx CAP. If you go to YouTube and search Tedx CAP, so Tedx CAHP, for the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, you will find the 4 talks that were original talks. If you go onto the TED site, you'll find those 4 talks that are original talks. We had more in our event than just those talks, but those are the ones that get out right away. And in that event, we were really fortunate. We had a few different viewpoints from different sides. We had one speaker from California who was a developer. And he stood up there saying, hey, I used to do new buildings for decades and then got into doing old buildings and realized I could make them more sustainable, I could make them better for the environment, and I could make more profit. Right? Like right away, this is something everyone starts saying, oh, it's too expensive to deal with an old building. Oh, you can't make them sustainable. Oh, you can't beat these. But there are people doing it. We just get around, we listen to them, and you become aware, hey, these are perceived obstacles. People are just not sure, so they say no, kind of thing. Same with, of course, Mark Brandt, who's one of the biggest names in kind of the technical side of the architectural, looking at sustainability of old buildings. He can walk through and say, hey, here's all the different options. Here's what's going on. Here's what we can do. We had one of the young presenters, emerging professional, looking at these house questions, saying, okay, let's walk through a house, how you can model a house, what that means. And flipping back over, and I'm not being anywhere near generous enough to these presenters. They did a huge amount of work, but we only have so much time here. We had our Jessica doing the presentation and referencing the UN building in New York City and how much less it would cost for them to retrofit it, how much better environmental benefits they were giving doing that. And so none of these are hidden gems. None of these are stuff that doesn't exist, right? Like this is all openly available, all public. It's just not getting out there. And that, in essence, is why we ended up doing the TEDx. The question came up saying, oh, well, you know, how do we get information out there? This has been going on for several years. I've been listening to that conversation. And then Ted fortunately created this initiative looking at Countdown, which specifically looked at how do we fight climate change? How do we do things to fight climate change? And this said, we're going to make it really easy for TEDx's to happen, to talk about this topic, and they have to be focused on action. So from the get-go with that involvement, we're saying, okay, we've done a lot of research. There's always more research to do. I have experience with the research world. There's always more things we can research, but we have a huge body. We need to keep making action. We need to make sure these facts are in front of people, and we need to make sure it's out to the general public, which a lot of the clients I deal out here that's not on their radar, that is actually better for the environment to keep an old building, and kind of understand that. So that's, in essence, what we did to create the TEDx Cap. And we're, once the ball came up, once someone said, hey, okay, I'll do this, because honestly, I kind of poked people and said, hey, have you heard about this? I'm hoping someone's already doing this, and everyone gets busy. We seem to be a rather busy group. Once someone stands up and says, hey, I'll do this, lots of people jump up and say, oh, I'll help you. And there are a number of people that I still think did more effort on it than I did, but we're here where we are now. It kind of ties into the second question, mentioning the connecting with youth or emerging professionals. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a few things, and the Heritage Hackathon will kind of focus on there. People want to make a difference. Like, at least in the construction industry and the technical fields, we've kind of started switching our mindset to saying, okay, how simple can we make it, really? How much can we automate each potential process? Because the idea is everyone's afraid of work, right? Like, who's going to do more work if they don't have to? Whereas more and more when we work with let's say the high school students, we put together the hackathon, we find that no, people want to believe in what they do. People want to see and know that they can make a difference with what they do. And taking the high school students and bringing them with a stonemason and saying, hey, work with a stonemason, let's break the stone in two. Having them work with an architect, saying, hey, let's see what these guys do, what they're thinking about. You know, most of the future generation wants to see a way to make a difference. And I think we're often shortchanging them by trying to say, hey, we're just going to make your job easier. They're not afraid of a challenge. And I think there's opportunities there, and that's somewhere that to me, I see something that we can take out and we can grow off, is to reach out, do more, be willing to take the risk to make something happen, and kind of see where we go. And Stephen Collette, who's very involved, I see he's gotten up the TEDx link. Thank you, Stephen. I think that's my little blurb.
Thanks so much, Tom. And yes, the Heritage Hackathon, I should have given the full name. It's the Adaptive Reuse Challenge for High School Students. and it's ran a couple of times, and we hope to do more. And that was a really interesting program. Now, just jumping on to Shannon, and then we'll have a question and answer period. But Shannon Bateman, she's our National Trust YCW intern. She's a textile artist as well as a heritage researcher. And I've just been fascinated to talk with her about the whole culture of repair and mending that she's embedded in. And I think there's some really interesting possible strong linkages with the heritage conservation community. Shannon, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Hello, I'm Shannon Bateman. I'm coming to you from Thunder Bay, Ontario, the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation and Robinson Superior Treaty area. I'm a recent graduate in the Public Folklore Master's Program at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And as Chris mentioned, I'm also a textile artist. So my interest as an artist fed into my graduate research while I was at Memorial University. And I explored a number of themes, one of which was the revival of traditional skills in the context of sustainability and activism. So one of my key projects was on mending and textile repair. So I conducted a series of ethnographic interviews with a number of menders and mending activists. So what the menders demonstrated to me is that we actually have a lot more power in our everyday interactions with the material world than we often realize. So what I came to in my findings is that the decision to fix something is in actuality a political decision in terms of rejecting a culturally ingrained impulse to dispose and replace. It's so easy today to replace items almost instantaneously, and we tend to value shiny new things over those that are aging and old. So the menders and the textile researchers and the repair activists are really actively exploring these ideas and communicating it quite effectively, I think, through a sort of a quiet form of activism that we don't traditionally see. So I shared some of my findings with Chris when I started my internship. And I've been basically exploring some of the connections between the sustainable textiles movement and heritage conservation throughout. So we've discussed how heritage conservation is really data driven. And so what I'm suggesting is maybe the heritage conservation could take some notes from the more human-centered and cultural approach of the textiles movement. So there really are quite a few parallels between the fashion and building industries in terms of environmental impact and climate change. So things like high carbon emissions from production to use to waste, heavy resource use, unsustainable consumption patterns, and unnecessary amounts of waste. So particularly in fashion, there's a tendency to focus on production and consumption rather than the ways that we actually use and relate to objects post-purchase. So what the menders and the advocates for repair are really saying is pay closer attention to the objects in your care and try to find satisfaction in the items that you already own. Basically what they're advocating for is making mindful usership a practice in daily life. So the question I've been exploring is, how can heritage conservation really tap into the emotive strategies in use by textile activists? And I certainly don't have the answers. It's more about posing the question and encouraging some reflection and discussion, and perhaps this idea of looking to other movements that are running parallel to our own in some sort of cross-sector collaboration. And so at the heart of this really is the need to reimagine the ways that we relate to objects, whether it's clothing or buildings, really thinking about how these objects fit into our everyday lives and thinking about the material world as a whole. And so, like I said earlier, this idea of mending and repair is really effectively taking hold in popular culture. It's spreading through all kinds of digital and educational networks in a really effective way. And I have really seen an increase, particularly among younger people, in taking up the skills and the spirit of mending and repair. So of course it's easier to repair an item of clothing than a building, but I think what we should pay attention to is perhaps the way that the repair movement is tapping into the intimacies of people's lives. I've heard of clothing referred to as sort of like a second skin. I'm just wondering if we can find ways to relate to buildings in the same ways, not necessarily as structures, but as homes and as pieces of ourselves. So using this emotive connection between building reuse and people's lives to sort of combat things like demolition and unnecessary waste. So that's basically it. It sounds really simple. It's nothing new, but I think that there's something really powerful in the simplicity of the argument for thoughtful usership in daily life. And maybe this is how heritage conservation can move beyond data-driven communications.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. It reminds me of the thinking about the intimacy of being embedded in the land and Indigenous kind of relationships with the land and how that differs from the Western approaches. There's some incredible parallels there. We have limited time here. We're over in 10 minutes, and I wanted to come back to that idea of the emotional and the emotive connection that you're talking about. I think for obvious reasons, the heritage movement has been exploring, looking at data to try to make those strong arguments, and we need that to make arguments with policymakers and to connect with at the political level and advance ideas. But have we missed the boat in some ways in creating those kind of intimate connections that you're talking about? And I wanted to open up to the rest of the group whether are we too fixated on the numbers as being the big moment when we can have the big reveal about how central we are to the questions of our time around climate change, or do we do something a little bit more personal? Tom, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, coming from someone that is very much a numbers guy, I would say we are worrying too much about the numbers. This is one of the, going through the TED process and to match up in line with what they require for their talks and what they encourage. This importance of our talks, developing connection, all that, doing everything engineers don't really. Like, engineers communicate one way, we're supposed to communicate for this another, but just figuring out how we are building connection with people and how we're just repeating it. Because so many things, it should be common sense that you look and say, hey, this is wasteful if I'm taking an entire building and dropping it in a dump. But that concept, which should be common sense, isn't being picked up by people as common sense.
Susan, you wanted to jump in?
Sure. Thank you so much, everybody. I really enjoyed these different perspectives. It's hard to just respond to the last one, but it does really connect a lot with concerns I have about waste and work I've been doing on that area. And I guess one of the other approaches that I'm thinking about that's really interesting besides repair is around sharing. So another idea, and actually I heard Sheila Watt-Cloutier say this the other day in a talk that was hosted by Carleton, where she was talking about that in Indigenous principles, sharing is the opposite of waste. Or I'm not phrasing it exactly, I'm misphrasing it, but this idea that one of the ways that waste can just not exist is if everything is shared. Because part of why we discard things is when we think they have no more value, but they could have value for whether it's an animal, living creature, or another person. So I think that belongs also in with the repair. And I just want to say one more thing in that. I think that about the data, we do need the data, but we have to be able to use qualitative discussions around as well as quantitative ones, right? And recently we're doing work on architectural salvage yard exchange centers, and discovered that from a data point of view, they're not that important. You know, how much material actually goes through these places is not going to save us from landfill. However, from a social point of view, these are places that educate people to think differently and to produce potentially new ways of working with materials. So they can help heritage, they can help recyclers, they can help educate. And so it's important that we not confuse the raw appearance of data with the effect things have. So
yeah, and I will amend my statement to match that you need the data in your back pocket, but you need to get your foot in the door. Because I had a building code person I was trying to fit on their standing committees to say, hey, energy efficiency isn't the best measure. And it still takes a while to kind of fit that over because it's not. But that's a whole other discussion, perhaps.
Melody, I wanted to jump over to you, and I'm thinking about like the those distant impacts and making them real that are happening on traditional territories like those in the Mikisew Cree in the near north. I mean, is that an opportunity for like showing some of the greenhouse gas and the climate change impacts there? Is that a way to start moving and changing behavior in the south? Is that a way to get things started?
I think so. Yeah, especially for us, we're an isolated community, highly dependent on diesel generated power because we really don't have any other source. We have an ice road to bring in, so food security is critical for us. Our duration of our ice road and winter road is shortening every year. So, you know, it's pretty scary for the community. We had a vehicle go in the ice this year. So safety and all of that. So I think just, you know, it's easy to live in a place like Fort McMurray or in the south with these conveniences, but when you put yourself in a situation of being in a remote community, my brother being one of them who lives in Wood Buffalo National Park, climate change is really having an impact on everybody there every day. You know, from safety issues to food security to energy security, and I think those visualizations aren't reality to many people. So how do we communicate that? How do we make you know, people's life experiences and challenges with safety and whether or not they're going to have heat tomorrow or food available for them, access to our traditional lands, again, a huge threat. So we started to use video and showing video. I spoke a little bit about, you know, the work that we're doing with UNESCO, but when I'm sitting down with somebody from the World Heritage Committee, they don't understand a lot of what I'm trying to, you know, the messages I'm trying to share with them in the stories. But when I show them a video and they get to experience from a traditional harvester life on the land and what they're experiencing, I could see a complete change. So perhaps, you know, a lot of more multimedia and visuals is one way that we're trying to share our story. And it's somewhat effective, but I think there needs to be more.
Well, that's great. And I see there's a number of questions coming in about wanting more information about Indigenous protected areas and criteria there. We don't have time to get into that today, sadly. Hopefully we can deal with that offline. We can connect you with the Melody. Quick question for Judith before we'll have to wrap up really quickly. I guess that with green with houses, often to get to the point of talking about green energy retrofits, you often have to articulate the value of the heritage place to begin with. I think oftentimes we're having to back up and explain heritage conservation isn't about, you know, reconstructing. It's not all about reconstructing museums, museum type buildings. It's a vision. It's a way of looking at the world of seeing places. So just curious, if you're always having to back up to talk about the heritage argument and the value of it in the first place with a lot of your discussions.
I think it depends entirely who you're talking to in that regard. A lot of the homeowners, obviously, that we work with, they have an older house, they chose to buy it. They have an interest in retaining that and making it work for them. So I think yes, we have a lot of discussions about windows and specific things, but generally overall, that a lot of them are, you know, they're very motivated to retain and look after their piece of heritage. I think at the policy level, though, it is very different. It is data driven. It's very much about how do we hit these numbers? How do we make the difference? You know, greenhouse gas emissions and so on. It's all tons and so on. And I think that's where we really do need to be able to make those arguments. Heritage can align with that, but it's one of many priorities for the city and for the governments, and so it's difficult to really get it written into policy in some way without having that data. And also, yes, we keep coming back to, well, why does it matter at all? And talking about retaining heritage and broader heritage in terms of streetscapes and character and so on, and the connections to history. We keep doing that. That's our ongoing task for sure with the wider audience.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And Tom had a great comment about heritage and getting beyond the use of that word as connecting with people as well. Thank you all to all of our panelists this afternoon or morning, wherever you may be, and really appreciate your time and insight. I wish we could have delved into it more, perhaps next time. Emily, you had a few slides that I wanted to show you what's happening next time, and then we will wrap it up. She's going to jump in here. We had our question period. There's more online on the National Trust's Regeneration Works website to get more information and tip sheets and other things there. Next slide, please. And our newsletter, of course. And also, why not consider becoming a member of the National Trust for Canada? Get our magazine, our quarterly magazine, discounts at the National Trust Conference, and free access to over 100 heritage destinations in Canada and abroad whenever we can go abroad after this COVID business. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate the discussion this morning, and hopefully we can have some more down the road. And thank you all once again.